Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet corner of time and memory, where stone walls breathe softly and doors hold the stories of centuries. Tonight, we will walk slowly through a church whose doors were found locked from the inside, letting whispers of the past and gentle echoes guide you into calm, reflective rest. You remember the first time you came upon the church, not as though it were a discovery, but as though you had wandered into something already waiting. Its quiet presence folded gently into the curve of the valley. The road was narrow, softened by moss and old stones, and the air carried the earthy perfume of damp leaves, so that each step felt cushioned, muffled, as if the world wished for silence before you reached the building. When you first saw its tower rising above the clustered trees, it did not strike you with grandeur or sudden awe, but with a gentler impression, as if it had been standing there all along, unnoticed yet patient. Its stones were pale with age, weathered by rain and sun, carrying the soft sheen of countless seasons. And between the mortar lines, tiny plants had rooted, their green threads seeming to stitch the walls together with quiet persistence. The roof, steep and dark, bore the weight of moss that gleamed faintly in the muted light, and in the soft hush of the late afternoon you thought it looked less like a roof and more like a hill draped in shadow. The air was cool as you drew nearer, touched by the faint sweetness of wild thyme growing at the edge of the path, and there was a stillness that seemed to gather itself in layers, folding gently around your breath. The windows, tall and slender, carried the muted hues of stained glass, their colors faded yet luminous, so that even without light passing through them they glowed faintly, like embers long buried beneath ash, but never entirely extinguished. You noticed the bell tower first, not for its height, but for its quiet refusal to move. For the rope that hung within was still, as though it had been waiting years for a hand that never came. The wooden doors were tall and arched, darkened by time, their surface rippled with grain like the flow of water frozen in place, and on them lay a sheen of damp that gave off the fragrance of old rain. As you placed your hand against the wood, you felt its coolness sink into your palm, not hostile, but steady, like the temperature of river stones, and you sensed a weight behind it, as if it carried the patience of centuries. You tried the handle not with force, but with curiosity, and the door resisted gently, unmoving, as though it had settled into itself so long ago that it no longer remembered how to be opened from outside. The latch rattled faintly, but did not shift, and you stood for a moment in the hush of that refusal, feeling not rejection, but a soft reminder that some places choose to remain hidden until they are ready. Around you, the churchyard grass stirred lightly, brushed by a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, carrying the faintest scent of rain on stone, and it felt as though the air itself was reminding you to pause. You let your eyes drift upward, and the tower seemed less like a structure and more like a gesture, a finger pointing quietly toward the sky, not with demand, but with a longing that stretched beyond words. The sky above was veiled in thin clouds, and the muted light seemed to soften every outline so that the edges of the church blurred slightly, making it appear both present and distant, as though it belonged equally to memory and dream. You stepped back a little, and from that distance the church seemed not imposing but protective, like a figure keeping watch in silence, holding within itself the hush of countless prayers you could not yet hear. The sound of birds reached you faintly, muted as if softened by the walls themselves, and the air was filled with a quiet expectancy, like the moment before a candle is lit in a darkened room. You walked slowly along the outer wall, your fingertips grazing the stone, rough in places, smooth in others, and the shifting textures felt like sentences, half-yearsed by time, still whispering fragments no longer meant to be read. There were carvings, faint and worn, their shapes softened into near vanishing. Yet, when the light touched them, you thought you could see traces of vines, petals, perhaps even faces, though the years had blurred them into suggestion more than form. Near the back of the church, the earth rose slightly, and from there the building seemed to grow more deeply into the land, its foundation half swallowed by soil, as though the valley itself had chosen to cradle it. You lingered at a window, its glass mottled with dust, and when you leaned closer, you thought you glimpsed shadows shifting faintly inside. Not movement exactly, but the way light sometimes lingers where none should be. The air smelled faintly of candle wax, though no flame had been lit, a fragrance that seemed both recent and ancient, as if the memory of fire had never left the place even when darkness claimed it. You pressed your ear against the stone, listening without knowing what you sought, and for a long moment you heard nothing but the slow rhythm of your own breath, until a softness stirred, like fabric brushing gently across wood. The sound dissolved quickly, and you could not tell whether it had come from within or from your imagination. Yet it left you with a calm so deep that you lingered longer, unwilling to break the stillness. Even as the evening light shifted toward gold, the church did not change in appearance, but seemed to drink in the fading glow, becoming less a building of stone and wood and more a vessel of gathering shadows and memory. The valley around it darkened slowly, filled with the perfume of damp earth, yet the church held its own light, faint and inward, as though it contained a secret flame that needed neither wick nor oil to endure. When you finally turned to leave, you felt as though the church did not release you entirely, for its silence clung lightly to your skin like mist, lingering with the softness of a memory not yet fully formed. You walked away slowly, the gravel crunching beneath your feet, the air cooling as the first stars appeared. And in that quiet, you carried the impression of doors locked, not with malice, but with gentle certainty. The path led you back through trees that now seemed to murmur with evening winds, and as their branches swayed, you felt as though they too carried whispers, telling you the church was older than even they remembered. By the time you reached the village, night had folded itself gently across the roofs, and the glow of hearths and lanterns seemed softer for the memory you carried, a reminder that you had stood before something quietly unexplainable. And as you lay in bed that night, the fragrance of old wood and distant rain still lingered in your thoughts, and though you closed your eyes, you saw once more the doors locked from the inside, keeping their secret in silence. In the mornings, when mist still drifted low across the cobblestones, you sometimes heard the villagers speak of the church, not in hushed secrecy, but in the softened tones reserved for things both familiar and untouchable. They spoke of it as one might speak of the weathered oak by the river, a presence so constant it became less a subject of conversation and more a rhythm of the valley, yet never entirely understood. When you listened closely, you noticed that no story began at the beginning, for each account seemed to arrive already half-shaped, like a melody picked up midway, leaving you uncertain whether it was memory or imagination being shared. An old woman, bent beneath her shawl, once told you that the doors had been locked long before she was born, her voice steady as though describing the color of morning skies rather than a mystery. She said her grandmother used to tell of weddings held within, of bells rung not in warning but in joy, their tones bright enough to scatter the mist and settle gently into the folds of every hillside. Another villager, a cobbler, whose hands carried the scent of leather and glue, told you that the church once opened to travelers seeking warmth, its candles burning through storms, their flames steady as though shielded by unseen hands. But when pressed, he admitted he had never stepped inside, nor knew anyone who had, and his voice drifted into silence, softened by the rhythm of his work, as though words could not cling to certainty. The baker, whose shop filled the mornings with the fragrance of rising bread, said that as a child she had pressed her ear against the wooden doors and heard a hum like bees weaving a hive in shadow. Yet when she spoke of it, her eyes grew distant, and she laughed gently at herself, brushing flour from her apron, saying perhaps it had been only the wind shaping sound into something imagined. The innkeeper, polishing wooden cups by lantern light, said the church was older than the stones of the village itself, laid before the roads, before the fields, before even the well where the water never ran dry. He claimed the valley had grown around it, folding the church into its heart as though protecting something fragile, though he admitted that no one alive could name the mason or the priest who had placed the first stone. At times, the younger villagers spoke of it less reverently, weaving the church into games, daring one another to touch its walls after nightfall, their laughter carrying more bravado than belief, though even they never tried the doors. You noticed how the elders rarely corrected them, for they seemed to understand that the building did not require defense, for its silence was its own reply, and no jest or rumor could diminish its weight. On winter nights, when the hearths burned low, you sometimes heard stories told not with certainty, but with the gentle drifting of memory, suggesting the church was a place where voices once gathered and never wholly dispersed. One man said that if you pressed your hand against the stone on a cold night, you could feel warmth from within, not heat exactly, but the faint pulse of breath, steady as the heartbeat of sleeping earth. Another recalled his mother, saying the bells rang once on their own, not in fear or mourning, but in a clear, gentle tone, as though the valley itself needed to be reminded that silence was not emptiness. The children, eager for wonder, said that if you looked closely through the colored glass, you might see shapes kneeling, though when you blinked they vanished, leaving only the shifting hues of dusk and your own reflection. No one ever spoke of the doors with frustration or longing, for their refusal to open was accepted like the turning of seasons, something steady and unquestioned, woven into the fabric of days that passed without measure. The villagers did not gather to debate the church, nor did they guard it as a relic. Yet, when strangers asked, they always spoke with a softness, as though the building was more memory than monument. You found yourself listening not only to their words, but to the silences between them, those quiet pauses where the air seemed to carry meaning of its own, like the hush that follows the extinguishing of a candle. When you asked whether priests still came, the villagers shook their heads gently, saying no one had served there in generations. Yet their tone carried no sense of loss, only a calm acceptance, as though absence itself had become presence. In the marketplace, beneath awnings scented with apples and herbs, you heard merchants say the church belonged not to faith but to time, for it gathered years as easily as stone gathered moss, holding each without judgment. Some claimed the valley was quieter because of it, that the wind softened when it passed the tower, that storms bent slightly before reaching its walls, though they admitted these were perhaps only coincidences shaped by habit. One evening by the fire, you listened to a weaver who spoke in long threads of memory, saying the church was a loom upon which silence itself was woven, each passing year a strand too subtle to see. Her words lingered with you, for as she spoke, you thought of the windows glowing faintly even in shadow, like threads of color woven into a cloth that never faded, carrying echoes of light no eye could name. When villagers told such stories, they did so without urgency, as though recounting a dream whose meaning did not need to be solved, for its beauty lay in being remembered, carried quietly from one voice to another. You realized that the church was never spoken of with fear nor with reverence, but with a tenderness that belonged to familiar mysteries, like the way stars appear each night, though no one commands them to. The sound of their voices carried more than the words themselves, softened by the rhythm of years, and you began to understand that the church was not only stone and wood, but also the hush of collective memory. Even when no one mentioned it, you felt its presence lingering in the air of the village, like the faint perfume of lavender long after a drawer is closed, a fragrance woven invisibly into the pattern of daily life. At night, as you drifted to sleep, you heard the echo of their voices merging with your own thoughts, leaving you with the impression that the church did not need to be entered to be known. It seemed enough that it was there, locked from the inside, its silence spilling gently into the valley, gathered in every story, every pause, every breath of those who lived quietly beneath its watching tower. And in those moments, with the moonlight softening the village roofs, you felt as though you too had joined in the unspoken agreement to accept the church not as a riddle but as a companion to time itself. In spring, when the valley softened beneath rains that fell like threads of silver, you would see the church surrounded by blossoms that leaned close to its stones, as though even flowers sought to listen to its silence. The air carried the scent of wet earth and lilac, and the walls of the church seemed darker, their stones deepened by rain, as if time itself had seeped into the mortar to settle quietly among the seams. Children ran past carrying garlands of daisies, their laughter skipping across puddles, and for a moment it seemed as though the church, though closed, was still part of their play, like a quiet elder watching from the threshold. When the rains lifted, sunlight streamed through windows mottled with age, scattering colors across the grass in faint, broken patches, and you could almost imagine those colors had once lit faces gathered in prayer long ago. Birds nested beneath the eaves, their calls echoing against the tower, and the flutter of wings seemed to belong to the place, as though the church had simply exchanged voices of hymns for the softer music of sparrows. By midsummer, the valley brimmed with warmth, the stones of the church holding heat from the long afternoons, radiating it back slowly at dusk, so that the air around it seemed touched by an invisible hearth. The grass at its foundation turned golden, humming with crickets, and the tall windows glowed faintly, their colored glass shifting shades as the sun passed, until evening laid a gentle cloak of indigo across the roof. On summer nights, you sometimes smelled wild thyme carried on the breeze, mingling with the faint dust of stone, and the church seemed less a building than a vessel for the slow breathing of the land. Lantern light from nearby cottages flickered along its walls, and you felt the quiet comfort of knowing that while no door opened, the building still received the night like a guest who arrived without knocking. By autumn the air grew sharper, carrying the fragrance of wood smoke and apples. And the church wore the season's colors, not on its stones, but in the leaves that fell softly against its walls in drifting blankets. The tower rose through misty mornings like a watchful tree stripped bare, and when the sun caught the stained glass at just the right angle, it cast fragile ribbons of crimson and amber across the damp ground. You noticed how the doors, though unchanged, seemed to deepen in hue, the wood darkened by damp air, until it looked less like timber and more like a page written upon by time's patient, invisible hand. When the wind rustled through fallen leaves, they gathered at the threshold as though the season itself wished to cross but could not, and you found a strange gentleness in that patient surrender to silence. On evenings when frost brushed the grass silver, the church seemed to glow faintly, its outlines softened by the breath of approaching winter, and you felt as though the building was waiting with the patience of stone. Winter came quietly in this valley, with snow settling first upon the tower, frosting the roof in white, and gradually wrapping the whole church in a stillness so deep it seemed almost to hush your own breath. The doors, rimmed with frost, gleamed faintly beneath moonlight, and when you touched the stone it felt smooth and cold, like holding the memory of distant water, the kind found deep below in hidden wells. Icicles hung from the gutters, catching the glow of starlight, and sometimes a single drop would fall, landing with the smallest sound, reminding you that even in silence, time continued to move in delicate measures. The valley's voices grew softer in winter, footsteps muffled by snow, and the church, standing quiet, became less a building and more a shape of memory against the pale horizon, as if painted into the season itself. Smoke curled from chimneys nearby, carrying the scent of pine, and you thought of warmth inside homes, while the church, unheated and closed, stood like a companion to the cold, a keeper of the season's stillness. When spring returned again, and snow melted into soft streams winding past its walls, you noticed how the cycle made the church seem timeless, as if each season was simply another garment it wore without resistance. The rain traced paths along stone, washing away the dust of winter, and small shoots of green returned, pressing against the base of its walls, as though reminding you that time does not only erase but renew. You realized that the church did not belong to a single season, but carried them all within, storing each like a verse of an unwritten hymn, whispered back slowly in colors, scents, and the shifting of light. In every season the building seemed to hold the air differently, bending sound and silence, warmth and cold, until you felt it was less a church than a mirror of the valley itself, answering with quiet patience. Even when no one looked, the walls carried the shadows of clouds, the reflections of stars, the trembling of rain, and you felt that the church was never alone, for it was clothed by the sky itself. Sometimes you wondered if its silence was not emptiness but fullness, each season weaving threads of time into its stones, until the building became less a structure and more a woven cloth of weather, memory, and stillness. You thought of how each season brushed its own hand against the door's rain, sunlight, wind, snow, and, though the wood never opened, it still carried the touch of the world like a page filled only with fingerprints. The church, locked from within, did not resist the seasons nor yield to them, but simply endured as a listener might, taking in the long, slow language of the earth, and holding it gently in silence. And in this way you came to see that the church was not only a place built of stone and wood, but a vessel that remembered time, its seasons not passing by, but passing through it like breath. So when you looked upon it, no matter the month or the weather, you felt the quiet presence of all seasons gathered together, woven invisibly into the walls, as though the church itself was the keeper of time. In the earliest light of morning, when the dew still clung to grass like tiny jewels and the air was crisp with the faint scent of earth, you could hear the wind whisper along the church walls, as though testing their patience. The first birds of day broke the hush with soft trills, and their song seemed to weave itself into the stones, pressing against the closed doors until it felt as if the building had learned the rhythm of morning. A distant crow, calling once or twice, carried across the valley and echoed faintly, mingling with the soft shiver of leaves, creating a subtle harmony that felt alive but not rushed, like a memory waking slowly. At mid-morning, the sun warmed the roof tiles, and the air above the courtyard shimmered gently. And though no human voice called from within, the church seemed to hum softly, vibrating with the quiet music of heat and shadow. When a breeze slid across the valley, it caught in the tower and produced a low, almost imperceptible murmur, as if the building itself were breathing in rhythm with the land, not demanding attention, but simply existing. At noon, when light spilled directly through the stained glass, the colored panes cast soft patterns on the stone floor, and the faint click of settling wood seemed like a gentle punctuation to the long silence. Occasionally, a small bird would flutter against a window, its wings brushing faintly against the glass, and you would hear the soft tremor, not startling but intimate, as though the church and the bird shared some secret conversation. In the early afternoon, the warmth of the sun pressed against the walls, and you could feel the stones radiate it slowly, producing a low, almost inaudible resonance, as if each block held the memory of centuries of light and quiet. The rustle of the trees carried faint echoes into the churchyard, and the soft crunch of gravel beneath a passing traveler's feet seemed amplified by the stillness, turning ordinary sounds into delicate, lingering notes that invited contemplation. By late afternoon, shadows stretched long across the courtyard, and you noticed that the faint creak of timbers inside shifted subtly with the wind, producing a sound like distant sighs, soft and gentle, comforting in their regularity. If you stopped to listen at dusk, when the last sun dipped below hills, the air cooled, carrying the scent of damp earth, and the stone walls exhaled slowly, releasing a quiet warmth that seemed to hold the last light for just a moment longer. The evening brought crickets and rustling leaves, their patterns subtle and unhurried, and the church seemed to absorb each sound, letting none escape, transforming the ordinary chorus into a hush that pressed lightly against the heart. Sometimes you thought you heard a distant bell, soft and muted, not ringing but resonating in memory, as though the building remembered voices long gone and let them drift briefly through the air before returning them to silence. Nightfall deepened the shadows and cooled the air, and the faint, occasional tapping of frost or settling snow produced a rhythm so delicate it felt as though the church itself were counting time in slow, deliberate measures. When the moon rose, its pale light touched the tower and painted faint silver lines along the edges of the roof, and the faintest stirring of wind seemed to hum against the glass, producing tones that were heard only in the imagination of those who listened. Even in the stillest hours, when the valley slept and no human footfall stirred, the church carried sound differently, the hush itself shaping echoes, the quiet holding resonance, so that you felt presence rather than absence. A soft rain at night created another layer of sound, its drops tapping upon roof and gutter, and each note seemed to pause before sliding gently into shadow, as though the building were breathing with the sky itself. Sometimes distant animals added low murmurs or the faint rustle of leaves, and these tiny, ordinary sounds mingled with the hum of stone and wood to create a texture of quiet so rich you could feel it settle against your skin. Inside, the timbers shifted imperceptibly, expanding or contracting with temperature, producing almost inaudible groans and creaks that spoke of age and endurance, a gentle language you could sense more than hear. You realized that each hour of day carried its own soundscape, subtle and unassuming, and that the church listened patiently, gathering all tones into a chorus too quiet for alarm, but full enough to hold memory. When you pressed your ear against the door, you discovered that the hush carried texture, warmth, and resonance, as if the building itself had its own pulse, faint but steady, in synchrony with the land around it. Even in the dead of night, when all seemed motionless, the faint exhalation of stone and wood, the subtle creak of settling earth, and the whisper of wind among the tower's shingles created a soft music that belonged entirely to that place. You came to understand that the church did not need voices to speak, nor bells to ring, for its language was found in the patterns of sound, in the small shifts and murmurs, in the careful balance between presence and stillness. And in those hours when you sat nearby, feeling the cool air on your skin and smelling the faint fragrance of moss and wood, you understood that silence here was not empty, but woven, like a delicate tapestry that welcomed attention without insistence. Even when storms rolled across the valley, scattering rain and wind, the church absorbed the tumult, letting each gust leave its mark in soft creaks and distant echoes, and you could feel it listen, patient and enduring, as though accustomed to every season of sound. By morning, when light returned to spill along the stones and birds resumed their songs, you realized that the building carried each sound of night gently into day, preserving the hush in a quiet resonance that seemed older than memory. And in every hour, from first light to deepest dark, you felt the presence of something patient and aware, not imposing or demanding, but quietly attuned to the rhythms of the valley and the breathing of those who paused to listen. You imagine the church once filled with soft voices, the quiet murmur of prayers rising like smoke, curling gently toward the rafters, carrying warmth and the faint scent of beeswax from candles long since extinguished. Men and women moved slowly along the stone aisles, their footsteps muffled by worn rugs, carrying the earthy fragrance of wood smoke clinging to cloaks, and every motion seemed deliberate, as though time itself had slowed to honor their presence. Children's laughter occasionally rang through the nave, bright as sunlight on water, and you can almost feel their small hands brushing against benches, leaving behind the faint, lingering impression of innocence and fleeting joy. Old women bent beneath shawls, whispered prayers softly, their words woven into the hush of the building, and you imagined the tremor of their voices carried like delicate threads across the high arches to meet the shadows. The priests, in long, flowing robes, moved with measured calm, their steps echoing faintly along the stone floor. and their voices, when they spoke, were warm and low, resonating with the pulse of the valley itself. Candles flickered in wall sconces, casting a golden glow that trembled across carved wooden pews, and the scent of melting wax mingled with the subtle perfume of damp stone and the faint sweetness of old flowers pressed between hymeneal. You can see them kneeling at the altar, hands folded, heads bowed, the light glinting softly on their hair and the collars of their garments, and you feel the quiet devotion echoing in your own chest, steady and gentle. Visitors arrived from distant farms, carrying the scent of hay and earth clinging to their boots, and each footstep sounded both welcome and tentative, as though entering the church required a gesture of respect, unspoken yet understood. The choir, small and sparse, breathed in the echoes of the nave, their harmonies weaving with sunlight through stained glass, and you can almost feel the vibration of their song threading through your own memory, delicate as a spider's web. Faint drafts slipped through high windows, rustling robes and stirring the air, carrying with them the faint chill of early mornings, yet the warmth of human presence persisted, creating a space that felt intimate despite its size. You imagine hands resting lightly on pews, tracing carved symbols smoothed by decades of touch, and the faint pressure of fingertips against wood seems like a quiet conversation across generations, held in the curve of grain and polish. Voices rose in hymn and prayer, but never sharply, always sliding gently along the stone walls, and you feel the resonance of sound gathered patiently, like water pooling in a stone basin, deep and calm and contained. Elderly villagers greeted each other softly, their words carrying the faint scent of hearth and cloth, and though casual, their tone held reverence for the space, as if familiarity had grown alongside respect in equal measure. Windows glowed differently at various hours, illuminating faces with shifting light, catching the silver of hair or the bright warmth of a child's cheeks, and you imagine the sun itself participating quietly in the ritual of presence. Sometimes a bell rang, not loud but tender, vibrating through air and stone, and you can almost feel its echo brushing across your skin, like a memory that reaches outward yet leaves no mark of demand or urgency. The scent of flowers placed on the altar lingered faintly, mingling with the soft dust of stone, as though the building itself inhaled their fragrance and carried it onward, preserving the gentleness of devotion long after hands had left the petals. Evenings brought a different hush, the fading light pooling along wooden pews, and the quiet became layered, mingling with the faint creak of settling timbers, the soft rustle of pages, and the slow rhythm of human breath. You imagine couples kneeling together, shoulders brushing, sharing silent prayers, and the warmth between them seemed to flow into the building, leaving traces like faint fingerprints in the air, lingering after their departure as gentle memory. Children learned to move quietly along aisles, their small feet hesitant yet curious, and the soft scraping of shoes against stone seemed more like music than interruption, woven into the overall hum of careful, respectful presence. You feel the weight of countless hands folded in prayer, the press of palms, and the faint tremor of fingers, all gathering into a resonance that was almost tactile, a presence that could be sensed as easily as it could be imagined. Candles dimmed slowly as afternoon waned, their smoke rising in delicate columns, and the gentle curling of each wisp seemed to hold the echo of words spoken, prayers uttered, songs sung, and laughter shared within those walls. You notice how the air itself seemed softened by the congregation, carrying warmth, murmurs, and faint scents of cloth, wax, and earth. And you sense the building itself responding, its stones holding memory like a sponge holds water. Even when empty, the church seemed to remember, as if every gesture had been recorded invisibly. Every whispered prayer preserved, and the hush that remained was not absence but the gentle imprint of countless presences. Sometimes, when the wind brushed against the tower, you imagine it as a sigh of acknowledgement, a recognition of all who had gathered there, and the sound carries faint warmth, like a remembered touch across centuries. You can picture hands resting lightly on hymnals, turning pages with care, the faint rustle blending with soft footsteps and the occasional settling of wood, a quiet choreography repeated day after day, week after week, in perfect patience. Visitors who knelt at the altar may have left no mark visible to the eye, but you feel the traces in the way light touched the pews, in the faint scent that lingered, in the slow echo that carried through arches long after they departed. Evenings closed softly around the building, the glow of lanterns outside spilling across moss and stone, and you sense the church holding itself gently, waiting not for ritual, but for the quiet pulse of life that always returned. The warmth of bodies, the rise and fall of breath, the gentle vibration of spoken words, and the faint scent of incense all lingered invisibly, like threads woven into the walls, and you sense them as surely as you sense the weight of the stones themselves. You understand that the church was not only architecture, but memory made tangible, holding each voice, each breath, each touch, as if it were a living entity composed of both stone and human presence. And when you stand outside now, doors firmly closed, you can almost hear the echoes of those gatherings, gentle and unobtrusive, like a distant lullaby carried on the wind, a tender whisper that the place had once known company and quiet devotion. If you trace your fingers along the cool, uneven stones, you notice faint scratches and etchings, small gestures left long ago by hands seeking to mark their presence quietly, without disturbing the solemn hush of the church. The carved initials, worn smooth by time and perhaps by the reverent touch of generations, seem to whisper the names of those who lingered here, their identities nearly lost but still held gently in stone. Tiny marks shaped like hearts, crosses, or abstract loops catch the light at certain angles, revealing a dialogue between stone and sunlight that only patience and close attention could uncover. In hidden corners near the altar, you sometimes find faint indentations where candles once rested, leaving behind traces of wax and heat, and you can almost sense the slow pooling of devotion pressing gently against the cold stone. High above, near the arches, you might notice the faint outline of a carving erased by centuries, its edges softened, yet somehow still holding the echo of a hand guided by thought and care long before your eyes arrived. Every scratch and groove carries the weight of intention, subtle and patient, a quiet insistence that someone, somewhere, needed to leave a mark, however small, upon a place that already held everything in silence. If you peer closely at the wooden pews, worn by generations of kneeling and shifting, you can see faint notches along the edges, invisible to hurried eyes, yet lingering like fingerprints pressed into the grain of memory itself. In the loft, small figures carved into beams are just discernible, angels perhaps, or playful shapes made by children left to wander in curiosity. their forms softened by dust and age, smiling faintly at anyone who notices them. The stone floor, uneven with centuries of footfalls, bears subtle depressions that map the patterns of movement, as if the paths of worshippers have been inscribed into the building's bones, carrying the rhythm of their daily lives. Somewhere near the base of the tower, you notice a small niche, shallow and overlooked, that once held a candle or perhaps a keepsake, and the faint scent of aged resin seems to linger even now, preserved by stone and shadow. Occasionally, you find faint scribbles, letters, or shapes so small and worn that they seem almost accidental. Yet you imagine them as prayers or messages left in quiet solitude, each one a secret conversation with the walls themselves. The plastered surfaces carry faint impressions, the ghostly outlines of things long removed, and if you run your hand over them gently, the textures seem to hum with memory, holding the shapes of hands, books, and objects that no longer exist. In corners where light barely reaches, you sometimes glimpse tiny carvings of stars, suns, or other symbols, and it feels as though someone once sought to capture the sky within the darkness, preserving its quiet wonder in stone. If you brush dust away from the sills of high windows, you can see faint scratchings, perhaps initials or tiny pictographs, so subtle they might have been unnoticed by anyone not leaning close, yet they carry the weight of private intention. Even the hinges of the doors bear small signs of care and use, faint grooves left by repeated touch, worn smooth in places, as though hands had pressed and reassured themselves through centuries of opening and closing, long before the doors became locked. If you listen quietly near the tower, the building itself seems to hum faintly, as though these marks and scratches are not merely decorative but hold energy, small secrets stored like echoes within stone and timber. You sometimes find tiny carvings near the altar steps, so faint they seem like shadows, and you imagine worshippers pressing their messages, initials, or prayers into the wood, leaving a record of love, devotion, or fleeting hope. Even the rough edges of the stone walls hold stories, small divots and chips that hint at labor and care, hands shaping and shaping the building over time, leaving traces of intention that are barely perceptible but wholly present. In quiet corners, where no footfall disturbs dust, you notice faint patterns that may be accidental, yet they feel purposeful, as though the building itself encouraged subtle gestures to mark the slow passage of years. The pulpit holds hidden scratches beneath the surface, worn by the weight of books and hands, and the faint scent of old wood and candle wax seems to cling there, a memory of sermons and lessons long faded into time. Along the stone threshold, where countless footsteps paused before entering, you find grooves and small chips, soft reminders that even the smallest touch leaves an imprint, and that the building remembers every approach, however fleeting. In the loft or the rafters, tiny carvings sometimes form patterns like constellations, and you imagine they were made by someone longing to capture a glimpse of the night sky within walls that were otherwise still and grounded. The church itself seems to hold these small secrets like a breath held and released slowly, allowing the world to pass outside while inside, the accumulated whispers of past touch and attention persist quietly in stone and timber. Even when you cannot see them clearly, you feel the presence of these subtle marks, like faint pulses beneath the skin of the building, gentle reminders that many eyes and hands have shaped and loved this space across generations. If you tilt your head toward the ceiling, you sometimes glimpse faint patterns pressed into the plaster, irregular and delicate. Perhaps the remnants of scaffolding or small messages, each one telling a story that only the patient could follow. The windows themselves bear tiny imperfections, bubbles and scratches that catch the light, each refracting color differently. And you feel that even these small irregularities are part of the church's quiet record of care, accident and intention combined. As you walk along aisles and approach corners often overlooked, the faint impressions underfoot and underhand seem to hum with presence. Small secrets woven into surfaces, invisible to casual notice, but tangible to those who linger. Even when empty and locked, the building seems to breathe with the memory of these gestures, as though the stone and wood themselves are repositories of the subtle acts of countless people, holding them tenderly without need for acknowledgement. You realize that the church's secrets are not hidden for fear, but for intimacy. Small traces of human presence preserved patiently, waiting for attentive eyes to notice the gentle conversation between past and present. And when you leave, brushing your hands along the worn stones and smooth wood, you carry a faint awareness of these hidden stories, each scratch, groove, and mark offering a quiet connection to lives that once touched this place with gentle care. You notice how morning light slips quietly through high windows, soft and pale, brushing the tops of pews and the edges of stone, illuminating dust motes that drift like tiny suspended stars in the still air. Sunlight glances along carved wood, catching edges worn smooth by hands long gone, and you feel the warmth of time passing gently across the surfaces. Each beam of light a quiet witness to the slow rhythm of the church. As the day progresses, light tilts and shifts, stretching golden fingers across the floor, dappling walls with subtle patterns, and you sense the building breathing in color, the stones themselves softening under the ephemeral glow. Through stained glass, sunlight refracts into muted reds, blues, and greens, painting fleeting rainbows on the walls and floor, and you imagine each hue as a whispered story, carried delicately from the outside world into sacred stillness. At mid-morning, the light seems warm and steady, pressing gently on faces and robes, and you feel it hold the air in quiet balance, revealing textures of stone, wood, and cloth that had been invisible in shadowed hours. Shadows lengthen slowly along the aisles, softening edges and creating pockets of gentle darkness. And you sense the passage of time not as abrupt, but as a measured, patient unfolding, with every sunbeam a silent guide. The altar glows differently depending on the sun's angle, sometimes kissed by direct light, other times touched only faintly. And you realize that these variations make the same objects appear subtly new with each hour, alive in their quiet transformation. Even the smallest carvings catch stray beams, revealing details overlooked in shadow. And you feel as if the building itself orchestrates light to honor both art and memory, highlighting the stories embedded in every surface. When clouds drift across the sky, sunlight softens, diffuses, and spills in gentle gradients, and the change feels tender, like the slow exhalation of a breath, casting a hush over the interior that invites contemplation rather than distraction. In late afternoon, sunlight slants through windows, touching rafters and beams with a golden glow, and you notice the subtle warmth seeping into stone and timber, as if the building itself absorbs sunlight into its memory. The play of shadow and light shifts constantly, sometimes revealing textures in relief, sometimes hiding them in softness. And you sense the church's surfaces responding, carrying each hour with grace, patience, and quiet attentiveness. When candles are lit, their flickering light joins the waning sun, casting a gentle glow that dances across walls. And you feel the warmth of both flame and sunlight mingling in subtle conversation, blending present and remembered warmth. In the evening, shadows dominate, stretching along walls and pews, and you notice the air cooling, the silence deepening, with light retreating like a gentle tide, leaving the interior in a soft, muted hush. Moonlight touches the stone unevenly, spilling pale silver across arches, pews, and floor, and you imagine it accentuating textures unseen in the day, revealing the tender contours of time worn into surfaces by countless hands and hours. Even in darkness, tiny imperfections in the glass and stone catch faint light, creating small glimmers, and you feel as though the building preserves a private, delicate glow for those willing to linger in quiet observation. The way light moves along carved details reminds you of slow gestures, hands brushing surfaces, fingers tracing forms, and you sense the dialogue between illumination and creation, subtle, ongoing, and entirely gentle. At night, when lanterns are lit, their flames seem softer than sunlight, casting shadows that linger and sway. And you notice how the warmth of small flames transforms the cold stone into a companionable presence, quiet and embracing. The pulpit, altar, and lectern each catch and hold light differently, and you feel the church's interior as a dynamic space, alive in reflection and absorption, where no two moments appear exactly alike despite stillness. Sunrise and sunset bring distinct atmospheres, the first tender, hopeful, and cool, the latter warm, fading, and contemplative, and you feel the building participating in the rhythm of day, shaped not only by stone and wood, but by light itself. Light and shadow trace unseen corners, high shelves, and rafters, hinting at carvings, dust, and small secrets hidden from casual view, and you sense the church holding these details patiently, revealing them only to those who slow enough to notice. Even during storms, when clouds blot out the sun, the faintest glimmers pierce through, producing a soft contrast between illumination and darkness, and you feel the interplay as a gentle dialogue, a quiet reminder of resilience and enduring presence. As candlelight fades with the night, shadows grow long, soft, and dense, but the memory of daylight lingers in walls and floor, and you sense that the church preserves each hour's light as if storing it in stone for those who return. When the first light of morning touches the building anew, you realize that every surface has shifted slightly in color, shadow, and warmth, and the church seems alive, waiting to greet each new day with quiet reverence. You notice that the play of light is never static, each hour and season changing texture, color, and mood, and you feel the gentle orchestration of sun, candle, and moon as a patient, unhurried storytelling. Even in silence, light carries warmth, memory, and presence, sliding along arches, walls, and pews, and you feel it as a soft, tactile pulse, not loud or demanding, but a gentle companion guiding you through the building's quiet rhythm. The interplay of illumination, shadow, and texture produces a subtle choreography, one that shifts constantly, revealing facets of the church that were hidden moments before. and you sense the building as both stage and audience to its own quiet performance. Even when you leave, brushing stone or wood, you carry the faint impression of sunlight and shadow lingering in corners, subtle warmth, and the quiet, patient pulse of a building alive in memory and light, holding presence like a tender breath. You step outside onto the worn stone path that leads around the church, and immediately the scent of damp earth and soft green leaves rises to meet you, carrying a quiet, patient sweetness that fills the air like a slow sigh. Moss clings to the bases of walls and old gravestones, soft and fragrant with rain, cushioning each footstep in a delicate hush, and you feel the subtle texture beneath your shoes, as if the garden itself were welcoming your careful presence. Flower beds, small and untamed, lean toward sunlight, their petals trembling lightly in the breeze, and you notice how the colors, muted and gentle, reflect off the church walls, painting them in shades of time and quiet care. A low wooden bench rests beneath an arching tree, dappled with shadow and light, and you imagine long afternoons spent here in stillness, listening to birds sing faintly and leaves brushing softly against one another. The air is cool and carries the faintest hint of herbs, thyme, sage, and lavender growing at the edges of paths, and you feel as though the earth itself has been infused with memory, a slow perfume of tending hands. Tiny insects hum lazily through the air, barely perceptible, and the gentle rustle of grass and leaves becomes a subtle accompaniment to your movement, like the softest accompaniment to a song only the attentive ear can hear. In a corner, a small fountain trickles quietly, its water catching the light and scattering tiny reflections onto nearby stone, and you notice how the sound resonates softly against the walls, a calm, measured heartbeat of the garden itself. Vines crawl up the sides of the church, their tendrils gentle and patient, wrapping around old stones without hurry, and you sense a conversation between nature and architecture, one of respect and slow intertwining rather than conquest. The garden seems aware of time differently than the church, slower, bending toward light and shadow, and you feel the interplay as a gentle lesson in patience, each leaf and flower unfolding in its own quiet rhythm. Butterflies drift lazily between blooms, their wings brushing petals with soft caresses, and you imagine the fragility of life and beauty here, delicate and fleeting, yet persistent in its quiet presence, lingering long after you step away. Birdsong carries softly from distant branches, echoing through arches and over stone, and you feel as though the sound is captured momentarily by the walls, held gently before drifting onward again into the wider air of the courtyard. The air carries warmth in sunlight and cool in shade, and you notice how the gradient of temperature shifts slowly across the garden, revealing textures, colors, and scents that the casual observer might overlook entirely. Small gravel paths meander through grass and flowers, worn smooth by careful steps over decades, and you feel the history in each stone, each curve and junction, as if the paths themselves have been mindful companions to all who walked here. A weathered gate leans slightly on its hinges, moss and lichen softening its edges, and you sense the quiet welcome it offers, an invitation to enter slowly, to linger, and to be part of the gentle world contained within. Fallen leaves gather in corners, brown and golden, their edges curling and fragile, and you notice the subtle crunch beneath your feet. a reminder of the passing seasons, carried without hurry or complaint by wind and time. You lean over a stone wall to peer at the surrounding fields, the light softening every edge, and the distant hills roll gently toward the horizon, their quiet presence echoing the slow, patient heartbeat of the church and garden combined. The fragrance of rain-soaked soil rises after a drizzle, mingling with faint traces of wildflowers, and you feel the garden's breath against your skin, gentle and continuous, carrying memory, life, and calm in equal measure. A single rose, half hidden beneath a vine, leans toward the sun, its petals faintly trembling in the breeze, and you notice the quiet insistence of beauty that refuses to be hurried, present even in the smallest corners. Shadows from the trees stretch and shift with the movement of the sun, and you feel the slow choreography of light and shade, as if the garden itself is performing an unhurried ballet for attentive eyes. The air carries faint warmth from the stone walls, accumulated throughout the day, and you notice the contrast with the cooler patches of soil and grass, a gentle reminder of the subtle exchanges between structure and living earth. You hear the soft hum of distant bees, their wings brushing against blossoms, and the sound feels like a whisper of continuity, the delicate thread of life carrying on in quiet diligence, unnoticed by most, but vital in its persistence. Small statues, tucked among the flowers, appear softened by time and weather, their surfaces worn, yet they hold an enduring grace. And you sense their presence as silent guardians, witnesses to centuries of calm, devotion, and unnoticed moments. The garden invites you to pause, to feel, to breathe, and in doing so, you notice textures beneath your fingertips: rough bark, velvety petals, cool stone, and you feel the tangible rhythm of care that has persisted here. You follow a winding path to a low stone wall, resting your hands briefly, and notice tiny carvings etched by past visitors, initials or symbols, each one a quiet echo of presence, a whisper of someone's private moment with the place. The breeze carries scents from distant trees, flowers, and soil, and you feel each inhalation as a gentle layering of memory, a soft weaving of life that connects the natural world to the stillness of stone and timber inside the church. You watch light shift as the sun descends, spilling golden warmth across petals, moss, and stone, and feel a gentle passage of time, as though the garden itself is breathing slowly, waiting for night to arrive with equal patience. Even as twilight descends, the garden retains whispers of warmth, scent, and color, and you notice how the air itself feels softened, as if every living element and every stone has taken a deep, unhurried breath. The quiet of the garden wraps around you, carrying scents, textures, and the slow pulse of life that refuses to be rushed, and you sense that it exists in harmony with the church, each tending to the other's memory and presence. As night approaches, the first stars reflect faintly in dew, and you feel the garden preparing for rest alongside the church, a shared calm, waiting patiently for the return of light, life, and another day of gentle attention. Even when empty, the garden hums with quiet persistence, every leaf, stone, and petal holding fragments of those who lingered here, and you feel a subtle connection, a gentle bridge between human care and natural rhythm that transcends time. You understand that this garden, like the church, is alive in memory, touch, and presence, and when you step away, you carry with you the soft fragrance, the warm textures, and the slow, attentive heartbeat of a world quietly preserved. When you enter the church, the first sound is the gentle echo of your own footsteps, soft and patient, bouncing slowly from stone to timber, reminding you that even absence carries a quiet presence. A faint creak drifts from the old pews as you shift weight, subtle and tender, a whisper of wood remembering generations of kneeling, shuffling, and the weight of hands pressed in prayer over long, patient hours. Footsteps and whispered conversations that have lingered like faint perfume in the air. Candle flames flicker in the corners, and their subtle hiss and pop become part of the room's breathing. A rhythm as soft as a heartbeat, measured and steady, attuned to the slow unfolding of light and shadow. Sometimes, when the wind brushes the windows, a distant moan or sigh filters through, delicate and airy, and you feel it as the church exhaling centuries of quiet devotion and fleeting conversations carried gently through time. Dust drifts in slanting sunlight, moving in spirals, and the faint sound of particles brushing against one another creates a whispering tapestry that seems to murmur the history of stillness, attention, and care embedded in every surface. Or the slow settling of centuries, and you notice how even these subtle movements are part of the building's quiet voice, magnified in the vaulted space, and it feels as if the church listens patiently, holding each inhalation and exhalation in gentle memory. Footsteps from outside sometimes carry faintly through open windows, distant and blurred, and you feel the church accepting these outside sounds without judgment, letting them mingle with its own internal whispers, like threads in a soft tapestry. When rain taps lightly on stained glass, the patter becomes a gentle percussion, a delicate rhythm against the stone, and you notice how each drop holds a faint resonance that stretches through the building, lingering long after it falls. The creak of the pulpit, subtle and low, seems almost like a voice calling attention to time and devotion, a reminder that even objects shaped by hands long gone continue to speak quietly in the spaces they occupy. Wind through cracks in old windows carries a distant hum, soft and melodic, and you sense that the building is translating natural movements into gentle sound. A subtle conversation between earth, air, and stone. You notice faint echoes of voices, not present but remembered, that linger in corners where the acoustics carry sound unusually, and you feel as if the walls themselves have preserved these fragments like delicate glass, shimmering in memory. The drip of water from high eaves becomes a quiet metronome, steady and patient, reminding you of the passage of time in moments so soft and unnoticed that they might otherwise slip completely from awareness. Footsteps along stone aisles, even the slightest shuffle, create a delicate counterpoint with the building's own hum, and you sense the way sound moves, bends, and settles, as though the church itself is performing a slow, invisible symphony. Soft rustlings from old hymnals, pages disturbed by drafts, create tiny, percussive gestures, and you imagine voices that once sang, now lingering invisibly, a chorus carried in air and wood, patient and unhurried in their quiet persistence. The ringing of bells, distant and low, echoes into the nave with a warmth that fills corners and crannies, and you notice how each note seems to settle slowly, vibrating against stone and timber in a lingering embrace. Even your breathing seems to be amplified, softened, and multiplied by space, creating a rhythm that interacts with other faint noises, as though your presence itself has become a thread woven into the church's quiet tapestry. Small drafts shift curtains and banners slightly, producing a gentle whisper as fabric brushes against wood. And you realize that even these minuscule movements contribute to the chorus of subtleties the church holds in delicate suspension. The faint hiss of candle wicks, almost imperceptible, joins the other sounds, a companion to the soft creak of hinges, the rustle of pages, and the distant murmurs of wind, together forming a gentle undercurrent that hums with patient life. When you place your hand on stone walls, you notice vibrations too subtle to be measured by senses alone, as if the church itself carries memory in pressure, motion, and sound, quietly reminding you of every presence it has held. The soft patter of footsteps outside on gravel or grass becomes part of the church's inner symphony, and you sense a kind of communion between space and listener, where even distant sounds are welcomed into quiet memory. You notice faint echoes from high vaults and arches, where every minor sound is carried in slow reverberation, and feel that these echoes are more than acoustics. They are the preserved gestures of time and attention, extending centuries backward. Even the silence feels textured, layered with the faintest resonances of past moments, the building holding it like a deep, unbroken breath, patient, attentive, and almost tactile in its soft presence. And you notice how the church allows its environment to participate, creating a living space of echo, shadow, and gentle resonance. Continuous sounds are the language of longevity, patience, and care, preserved invisibly across centuries, and you feel the history embedded in every joint, hinge, and surface, as if every object in the church carries a memory waiting for someone willing to listen. Creaks, whispers, and pulses, a delicate music of absence and memory that seems to hold you gently. When you pause to close your eyes, you realize the church's voice is constant, subtle, and enveloping, a symphony of soft presences, waiting for attentive ears to gather fragments of time into a patient, quiet understanding. The building seems to breathe alongside you, inhaling faint echoes, exhaling whispers of past lives, and you notice that these sounds, though almost imperceptible, fill the space with warmth, memory, and continuity that is felt rather than seen. Even when empty, the church holds a quiet hum of life, a gentle layering of echoes, creaks, and whispers that refuses to be hurried, inviting you to linger in its resonance and carry it softly in memory long after departure. You feel that the church's sounds are not accidental, but intentional, small markers of life, time, and attention, and that every subtle noise, from candle flicker to distant footfall, forms a delicate web connecting past, present, and quiet, watchful stillness. You stand before the church doors once more, their wood worn, smooth, and fragrant with age, and you feel the subtle pulse of memory embedded in grain, hinges, and ironwork, a slow heartbeat of centuries quietly preserved. The handles are cool beneath your fingertips, slightly rough with wear, and you notice how the texture carries the imprint of hands long gone. Each press and turn a gentle echo of devotion, attention, and quiet presence. Sunlight falls softly across the panels, highlighting the delicate cracks and faint scratches, and you sense the subtle artistry of time. The building itself, recording lives, small gestures, and the patient persistence of human care. A faint breeze slips through edges and keyholes, carrying with it scents of dust, wood, and the lingering perfume of candles, and you feel the threshold as a boundary, not only of space, but of accumulated memory. The doors seem to breathe slowly, absorbing sound, light, and touch, and you notice that each gentle push or pull resonates like a soft chord, harmonizing with the quiet hum of walls, pews, and vaulted ceilings beyond. You linger at the threshold, feeling the temperature difference, warmer air from inside and cooler air from outside, and the subtle contrast makes the space feel tenderly held, a liminal place where presence and absence meet quietly. Every groove in the wood tells a story, each dent and nick a record of cautious hands, hurried departures, and lingering embraces. And you sense that the doors themselves carry the pulse of every visitor who has paused here. As you trace the ironwork with your fingers, the cold metal feels alive with history, subtly worn where palms have rested or turned keys. And you realize that the doors are a repository of patience, devotion, and careful attention over time. The lock itself is ancient, sturdy, yet unobtrusive, and you feel its quiet insistence, a reminder that boundaries can hold both protection and invitation, that a closed door need not be cold but a gentle guard of sanctuary. When you lean close, you can hear the faintest echo of hinges shifting, as if the doors remember their own movement, the rhythm of opening and closing, the slow cadence of centuries of quiet passage through their frame. You notice the subtle scent of wood and metal mingling with candle wax and stone, and you feel the doorway as a living threshold, alive with all the soft textures, aromas, and temperatures that mark both presence and absence. Light from within filters through cracks and keyholes, creating narrow streams that highlight dust and faint textures, and you sense that even in slight illumination, the doors guard the interior with patient dignity, holding stories softly in the spaces between. The doors respond subtly to wind, touch, and warmth, and you feel that every small interaction is preserved, an ongoing dialogue between human hands, natural elements, and the patient pulse of the church itself. You imagine the countless footsteps that have approached this entry, each visitor bringing breath, scent, and warmth, and the doors carry all of this without complaint, retaining fragments of life like delicate, invisible threads. Even when left untouched, the doors seem to hum faintly with memory, a resonance that reaches the stone beneath your feet and the timber overhead, creating a subtle presence that is felt more than heard, a gentle companion in stillness. You run a hand along the surface, noticing subtle variations in grain and temperature, and feel the interplay of sun, shadow, and centuries of touch, as if the doors themselves are breathing, alive in patience and enduring quiet. The hinges creak softly when nudged, a sound tender and brief, and you notice that each tiny noise is like a heartbeat, rhythmic and calm, joining the whispers, echoes, and soft sounds that linger throughout the church's interior. You observe how the door's threshold meets the stone, worn smooth by careful steps over decades, and you feel the continuity of care, a tactile bridge between human intention and the slow endurance of stone, wood, and metal. The doors frame the interior as a quiet stage, holding within their weight and form the light, air, and texture of the church, and you sense that they are not barriers but guardians, mediating between the outside world and the sacred calm inside. Even in twilight, the doors retain traces of the Datha warmth of sun, the scent of dust and flowers, the subtle echo of windand. You feel them as patient witnesses to cycles of light, presence and absence that shape the church's rhythm. You imagine what it would be like to step across the threshold, feeling stone beneath feet, light on skin, and the subtle chorus of echoes, and sense that every entrance is also a passage into memory, quiet and tender, held in the building itself. The door's ironwork glints faintly in low light, and you feel the cold metal against warm hands as a grounding presence, a tactile reminder that human touch leaves quiet traces that endure through decades, patient and unnoticed. Even the smallest cracks, filled with age and dust, carry stories, and you notice that the threshold is alive with subtle history, an archive of all the careful, gentle interactions that have passed unnoticed by casual eyes. You feel the weight of the doors as both literal and symbolic, a measure of protection and welcome, and sense that they honor every pause, gesture, and breath taken in their presence, holding memory as a tender, quiet responsibility. When you finally step away, brushing the wood lightly, you carry with you the texture, warmth, and faint scent of the doors, a gentle imprint of their quiet patience, and sense that their memory accompanies you, lingering softly in your awareness. The church behind them remains calm, illuminated by fading light and soft shadows, and you feel the doors as both boundary and bridge, guarding history while offering welcome, sustaining the rhythm of stillness that has existed for centuries. Even as darkness gathers around you, the memory of touch, texture, and subtle warmth lingers, and you understand that these doors, simple yet profound, preserve a world of careful attention, patience, and quiet continuity, waiting for those who return. You breathe slowly, noticing the gentle weight of time in wood and metal, and sense that each entrance and departure, each lingering hand, is quietly honored, leaving traces of life softly imprinted upon the patient heart of the building. The church seems to exhale behind the doors, soft and unhurried, and you feel a final resonance, the combined pulse of light, sound, air, and memory preserved in wood and stone, a gentle companion guiding you into reflection and calm. As you move away, the doors remain patient, quiet, and aware, holding all who have touched, seen, or lingered nearby, and you carry a gentle sense of reverence for this place, a tender echo of memory and presence that will remain long after your footsteps fade. The church, its doors, and the spaces between hold stillness, warmth, and light as a lasting archive of presence. And you notice how each sensory fragment, touch, scent, temperature, shadow, forms a soft map of time quietly preserved in patience and care. Even as night settles fully, the doors keep the memory of the day, the echoes of footsteps, the faint warmth of hands and sun, and you sense that all these fragments coexist, gently stored, waiting for the quiet attention of someone willing to notice. You leave, finally, carrying the weight of texture, sound, and light with you, and feel the doors standing patient, gentle, and enduring, a soft threshold where history, memory, and presence linger in perpetual, quiet embrace.